Aristotle now turns to the question of the nature of the parts of the city, and he begins with the household, which is the subject of the rest of Book 1. Here, he's not thinking of the modern conception of the nuclear family. Instead, for him, a household also involves slaves who are attached to it just as much as our actual family members. The institution of slavery was virtually universal in the Greek world. While estimates vary considerably, it's been thought that during the 6th century, the number of slaves in Athens was more than double that of the entire adult male population. Since his description of the household is of a unit that contains slaves, this would seem to imply that there were indeed slaves belonging to most every family, even those who were not particularly rich. Most of these slaves were prisoners taken in war, and many of them were Persians. While they were regarded as human at some basic level, they had no rights and from a legal perspective were considered property which had a mercantile value and could be bought and sold. It's also been claimed that, somewhat paradoxically, the highly praised democracy of Athens was largely dependent on the institution of slavery. Athenian democracy required a large degree of active participation by adult male citizens who would be chosen by lot to sit on juries or take on specific functions at any given time. This required that people were available to serve in this capacity. Slavery made it possible for the men of Athens to have this leisure, since the slaves would perform the work required for the household while the men were busy with their civic duties. Aristotle's picture of human relations is fundamentally hierarchical. The household consists of different variations of this. According to this view, in marriage, the husband is the superior and the wife the subordinate. Similarly, parents are the rulers of their children. Most obviously, the slave owners are the masters to their slaves. Today, this kind of idea is offensive to most of us since we believe in the modern principle of equality. The Greeks also had a preliminary sense of this concept in their idea of democracy, but as we've noted in connection with Solon's funeral oration, the principle was not extended to everyone. Only free adult male citizens were regarded as equal and enjoyed full rights, and everyone else was excluded. Since Aristotle regards humans as a special kind of animal, it makes sense that he seeks in nature the origin of human relations. This leads him to the conclusion that there are some people who are by nature masters and others who are by nature slaves. To put it in less offensive language, one might say that his idea is that there are some people who naturally take the initiative. They are natural managers and can effectively organize and motivate groups of people for specific tasks. By contrast, there are other people who tend not to take the initiative in anything. They are passive and simply react to whatever happens to them. These people function best when someone tells them what to do. The former are the masters and the latter the slaves, each of which simply follow their own nature. Therefore, Aristotle conceives of a slave as primarily an instrument that the master can use to accomplish certain tasks. He refers to slaves as animate tools in contrast to inanimate ones such as hammers and saws. Aristotle presents this as a kind of symbiotic relationship. Each side needs the other. The masters need the slaves in order to do the work that they can't do on their own, and the slaves need the masters to tell them what to do, and thus to organize their lives in an effective manner. This is, according to Aristotle, an advantageous relationship for both parties, since each of them gets something that they need. Indeed, neither could function effectively without the other. In order to support this idea, Aristotle appeals to an analogy. According to his view, every animal consists of both a soul and a body, a theory that he develops in his work on the soul. It's the soul or mind which controls and, so to speak, rules the body. It's unnatural and leads to decadence when the body rules the soul and not vice versa. Thus, the soul is the master and the body the slave. The soul needs the body in order to live and act in the world, and the body needs the soul in order to organize and direct its actions. It's therefore natural and right for the soul to rule the body, and it would be directly harmful if the opposite were the case. According to the analogy, human beings in society, although they are separate individuals, play different roles as they act, in a sense, as a single organism. The master is like the brain or the mind that directs the slaves, who are, in a sense, an extension of his body. We might initially agree that there are different personality types and that indeed there are some who are better at taking the initiative and others who are not so good at setting their own goals and organizing their own affairs. But we're extremely reluctant to accept that these relations are fixed, necessary facts of nature and that some people are by nature determined to be slaves. But it's Aristotle's contention that nature creates individuals for the one or the other role, giving them the specific nature and qualities that they need to fulfill it. In short, quote, some persons are free and others slaves by nature. Aristotle addresses the counterargument that not all slaves are determined by nature to be slaves. Given that the majority of slaves were in fact captured prisoners of war, this means that prior to the war they were free citizens ruling over their own households. Thus, they went from the status of being masters themselves to being slaves. In such cases, it would seem that nature determined them to be masters, but then the contingency of war rendered them slaves. In these cases, slavery would be a matter of human convention and not something determined by nature. Aristotle concedes this point, but still maintains that there are also some people who are slaves by nature, even though there are instances such as this where this is not the case. Thus, there are two kinds of slaves, those by convention and those by nature. He goes on to argue that it is just to wage war, to enslave people who are slaves by nature, but who offer resistance to being enslaved. Suffice it to say that this lack of respect for human dignity and integrity that appears so frequently in the Western tradition is very antithetical to our modern intuitions. It shows clearly how our modern conception of individuality and subjectivity is not something that existed from the beginning of time. Instead, these are ideas that developed historically and took a long time to find acceptance.